you're on this call, you probably already know what a citizen assembly is. But if you don't, let me just say that they offer a means of bringing representative groups of people, randomly sampled to match the composition of the community from which they are drawn, to deliberate over some of the hardest to address issues facing politicians, that is, elected officials, and community members. So think climate change policy, reproductive rights, land use and housing issues, and so on. And over the course of this series, we've asked elected officials and city managers why they've used this technique and what are the pain points they encounter in deploying citizen assemblies, but also the opportunities they unlock. And we've also explored how these gatherings build trust, both in government, but also in the collective wisdom of the people that government officials represent. And today, we ask how we can better fund and replicate these efforts, which require resources that are rarely available to municipalities. Not least, we will ask what role public-private partnerships play and what is gained and lost if we resort to funding citizen assemblies in this manner. So, like a citizen assembly that brings people across boundaries to work together, this is very much the effort of a joint labor of love with New America and FIDE North America. So I really especially want to thank my two brilliant colleagues and counterparts, Marjane Sassi at FIDE North America and Hollie Russon Gliman from New America. Hollie will be moderating today's session, so let me give her a more fulsome introduction. So Hollie is Senior Fellow at New America. She also serves as Visiting Fellow at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at Harvard University, and she's Senior Advisor to the Trust for Civic Life. And I'm only actually beginning to scratch the surface of the network she spans and holds together. It's really a privilege and a gift to work alongside her. It's one that I genuinely cherish. But above all, her dazzling thinking, her generosity speak for themselves. So I'm going to hand things over to Hollie, and I think people will see exactly what I mean by that. So Hollie, over to you.
No pressure. Well, thank you so much, Tom. First of all, a big thank you. I think for everyone out there joining us, this is dedication. It could be very early based on where you are, or 11 a.m. on the East Coast. We're really grateful to have you all. We want to make this interactive, informative, and fun. So just a quick round of thank yous. We are honored. I'm a senior fellow at New America's Political Reform Program, as Tom mentioned. We are honored to partner with Columbia World Projects and FIDE North America. I want to give a big thank you to Sarah Jacob, my colleague, Tom Asher, Anna, Priya, Marjan. This is an extraordinary group of folks that I feel privileged to work with. And this is a series. We've done quite a few in the series, and I'll talk more at the end about our fall follow on, but it's really a nice partnership and collaboration. And I think part of the reason we need collaboration and partnership, as we'll talk about today, is that citizen assemblies require a real interplay of civil society, government officials, external support, whether it's technical assistance, expertise, funding. And so as we think about democratic innovation and rebuilding trust in institutions, finding ways for people to have more civic voice, more civic power, have more inclusive, equitable systems of governance, it's going to take people coming together to do that. And so I think the partnership between Columbia World Projects, New America, and FIDE is one example. And then our three amazing panelists are another example. So we sort of have the two preeminent organizations that have been implementing citizen assemblies and other participatory deliberative democracy experience in the United States and in Canada. And then we have a leader inside the government who has been really implementing this in the city of Boulder. So you could not ask for a better group of people. I am really honored and delighted to be here and share it with you. I'm just going to briefly do introductions, and then I'll turn it over to our first panelist. So we have Richard Johnson joining us from Mass LBP, as I mentioned, that is Canada's leading democracy consultancy, where they have designed and facilitated more than 24 citizen assemblies, reference panels, public meetings, and other engagements, and provincial and national work. We have Linn Davis from Healthy Democracy. Healthy Democracy has been doing incredible work with an emphasis on lottery selection procedure, process self-governance, and urban planning integration, as well as systems level thinking around democratic innovation. And we have Vivian Castro-Wooldridge from the city of Boulder, Colorado. Vivian is an urban planner and civic engagement strategist with over 20 years of experience advancing participatory governance and inclusive urban development. So we're going to really hear from these different counterparts of what it takes to put this together. And then we urge all of you, we want this to be really interactive. Come to us with our questions. They can be hard hitting. They, can really run the gamut as we think about sort of what does it take to finance, to sustain these models, and what's really missing from the conversation. So, just a huge amount of gratitude. I feel so honored and lucky to work with Tom and Marjan and Sarah and Priya and this whole collection of thoughtful, kind individuals. I'm going to turn it over to Richard, and thank you all.
All right. Thank you so much, Holly, and good morning, everyone. I am going to share my screen and introduce everyone to the Victoria Saanich Citizens Assembly. These are the 48 folks who volunteered to spend about 8 months of their lives helping to determine whether these two communities, Victoria and Saanich, neighboring communities here on Vancouver Island and the far, far west coast of Canada, should amalgamate and become one. And I'm going to use this as my reference point. This is about the 50-something Citizens Assembly that Mass has designed and facilitated since 2008, and about the 24th or so that I've been privileged to work on in some capacity. And a quick overview of the kind of the Assembly's design and what it was. We sent out 10,000 invitations to randomly selected households across the two municipalities. That was about 1 in 12 households across these two neighboring communities. We received about 300 people who said, yes, sign me up. I'll give you 8 months and 60 hours of my time. And from those, we conducted a civic lottery to randomly select 48 assembly members, demographically representative, of course, of the two communities. They agreed to spend 8 Saturday sessions over about 8 months, learning together, deliberating together. We also organized 4 public meetings to create touch points between the assembly members and the wider public to allow perspectives to meet and mingle. 21 guest presenters and experts presented to the assembly over those 8 sessions, providing kind of both technical, community-based expertise and perspectives that would kind of bear on municipal governance and the affairs that would bear into amalgamation question. We also opened up public submissions, a process by which any member of the public could make a written submission to the Assembly for them to consider. In total, about 60 hours of learning and deliberation, and there was one technical study that was a part of this process as well, a separate firm from us that basically spent 9 months doing research with the two municipalities and putting together a side-by-side technical comparison of the two municipalities as one key piece of evidence that the Assembly considered. The mandate was clear: explore the cost benefits and disadvantages of amalgamation and make a recommendation to councils on how they should proceed. It also had a clear outcome, although the final report is not due publicly until July when it goes to councils. The proverbial cat is out of the bag. I'm not sharing any information that is secret. At the final session in April, we held kind of a bit of a closing ceremony for the Assembly where we invited the mayors, councillors, city staff, and all of the presenters and experts who had been a part of the process to kind of hear the Assembly members read out a draft version of their recommendations, which included to recommend amalgamation and further recommend that it go before voters in a referendum at the next municipal election and be backed by a robust public education campaign. So that's a bit about the process and design. I'll talk also obviously about the funding and budget of this project. The total budget was $750,000, which, yes, that's an anomaly, a little bit high for what we usually do. A third of that came each from the two municipalities and then the provincial government. Also a bit of an anomaly to have multiple levels of public funding and that it be all publicly funded. And it also came as a result of a ballot question back in 2018. In which it was a non-binding question put to voters in both municipalities. Are you in favor of spending up to $250,000? And it gave both councils and municipalities kind of the mandate to go ahead and pursue spending this money. And the province had agreed to match it 1/3 if it indeed went forward. And just if you're a bit curious, I'll kind of share the top level breakdown of where that money went, more than a third of it just for that technical analysis that provided one key piece of evidence for the Assembly. A little under half of it then for the cost of actually producing and executing, facilitating the Assembly itself. And about 15% were expenses kind of borne by the two municipalities around things like public meetings and so forth. As I wrap up, I just want to say a couple of things about kind of the funding for this project. As I mentioned, it was a bit of an anomaly in terms of being a much higher total budget for the project, and with the funding being entirely public and coming from different levels. And also that it, of course, came really as a result of a ballot question in which the public kind of were able to give their consent, as it were, to spending the money on the Citizens Assembly. But I also want to say that it represents a lot of the groundwork that had to be done behind the scenes and over the years to get us to this place. One example is that there was an earlier Citizens Assembly on amalgamation between two smaller communities here on Vancouver Island about 7-8 years ago that provided a little bit of a model and also gave gave a bit of the evidence of its success to maybe skeptical city staff and councillors in Victoria and Saanich to go ahead and take a chance on this kind of thing. We had to be a bit scrappy, we as in mass, to kind of do some of the legwork, provide advice and counsel to staff and councillors to kind of lay the groundwork for this, and basically be ready to advocate for ourselves in assemblies at every step along the way. And that was a multi-year process. I also want to say that what was really key is being able to take advantage of favorable local conditions. At various levels. One, amalgamation is been a grassroots topic of conversation here for about 2 decades. So we're kind of picking the moment, so to speak. The provincial government has been encouraging municipalities to explore amalgamation where possible. It makes their lives, I guess, easier as well. And again, there had been political conversations over the past 2 decades about whether amalgamation could take place. And it was really that case of where the politicians are maybe stuck. They don't know how to proceed. They don't feel they have a mandate to go one direction or the other. And so this is where you can see a Citizens Assembly as kind of a bit of an arm's length citizen-led process that kind of steps in where elected officials may not be able to get an issue of public debate kind of over that finish line. The Citizens Assembly can play a really strong role in that. So I think I'm at time. I will stop there and pass to my wonderful colleagues and look forward to some questions down the road.
I think you're up next, Linn.
Oh, we're headed straight from one to another. Awesome. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Linn Davis. I'm part of the programs team at Healthy Democracy. We're a nonpartisan nonprofit based in Portland, Oregon, but we work all over. We've been around for about 17 years or so, and we're best known for something called the Citizens Initiative Review, which is a specific type of citizens assembly, or civic assembly, as we call it, that does voter information on ballot measures. But we've also been doing local government assemblies in different parts of the US in the last 5, 6, 7 years or so. And I'm going to talk about a few of those and how they were funded specifically here. I'll also just mention that some of our other interests still include the initiative system and integrations with the initiative system. I'll mention that. And also other parts, sort of program design related to internal self-governance and universal design, information inflows are some of the things that we're sort of working on in addition to projects. We just completed, I'm going to kind of work backwards, a project in Fort Collins, Colorado, with the city there around a land use question. And the question was decided by, was recommended. A recommendation was released just a few weeks ago by an assembly that worked over 4 days, over 2 weekends, on a site that used to be the old football stadium for Colorado State and was put to a ballot measure a few years ago. Voters decided that it should be some kind of natural area or park, and the question was what kind of things are going on that site. So a fairly, textbook planning process, similar in some ways to another process that we ran a few years ago in Petaluma, California, also on a land use issue. But in any case, this project was mostly funded by the city, $150,000. Similar numbers, incidentally, to the project we just saw up in BC in terms of the number of mailings and responses. This one was shorter, 4 days, as I mentioned, and a collaboration among a bunch of different nonprofits and the city. And sorry, so the funding model for this was $150,000 and then an additional about $50,000 from private sources and a bunch of donated staff time totaling, we're not sure, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 50,000 plus additional dollars. So we're approaching $250,000 for this project total. That's similar to the previous project we did, which was in Eastern or Central Oregon, rather, that was totally privately funded, but a similar amount of money, slightly more, totaling probably around $300,000, of which it was all privately funded. And by a number of foundations. And that was on a more general topic on youth homelessness, connected with a HUD grant that had previously existed and created a body of currently or formerly unhoused youth who co-hosted this project to bring a broader spectrum of folks from across the community to bring policy advice on sort of on top of that grant making process to carry on in conjunction with this youth commission. Very interesting process from the perspective of that relationship and a totally different funding model meant as sort of a pilot project, a catalyst for further projects in the area. In fact, it has resulted in a half-time staff position, I think, in the Council of Governments in the region. So and some movement on some of these topics from local government and possibly some influence on state legislation that's pending. So there is there's certainly value to that model as well. Previous project to that, the two previous, well, one that happened and one that very nearly happened, but got stalled for not money related reasons in politics of a city. Both of those were going to be fully publicly funded. And I'll talk about the one that did happen, although the other one was going to be about over double the size in terms of cost. And the one that happened was in Petaluma, California, Northern California, about an hour north of the Bay Area, on a land use topic, city-owned piece of valuable and contentious property, and deciding what to do with it, an old fairgrounds property, still the fairgrounds property, that was managed by a state commission, and as sort of a property manager year-round and managing the fair. And their lease was up for renewal, decision about whether to renew it and what to do with the property. That was $450,000, 12 full days. These are all full day sessions in these cases, over 2 months, because of the policy situation in that case. It was unfortunately a little bit compacted. We would have loved to spread it out, but 12 days over 5 weekends in that case, plus an additional 24 paid hours. All of these are paid for the delegates after the assembly wrapped up to do their own PR and lobbying and other and process design. They sort of did a mini kind of visualization exercise and that kind of thing that they designed themselves and paid for with their own funds that were separated from the project, which I think is certainly our what we want to be our standard model going forward when funds allow. And in that one, funds were fully from the local government. In previous projects, there was a mix. There was one project before that that had similar to in Victoria and Saanich, a three-way split between local, state, and private funders. And many of the old initiative review projects, all of the old initiative review projects, except for one actually, were fully privately funded. However, that's the reason why they aren't happening anymore. So can talk more about that. But I think my 5 minutes is about up, so I'll pass it on.
Thank you, Linn. Hi, everybody. It's so lovely to be here, and I can see there's some really exciting questions and comments in the chat. I think we can maybe get to them after I share with you a little bit about the experience in Boulder, Colorado. So I'm humbled that it is our only assembly and it's still underway. So keep that in mind. And I'll share with you a little bit about the context first before I share some lessons specifically about financing. So Boulder, Colorado, in case you don't know us, we have a population of about 106,000. We're a college town, about 30 minutes away from Denver. As a city, we're always trying to strengthen our engagement practice, but I'd say we have a strong engagement culture. And we have a team of 9 staff focusing exclusively on engagement. So pretty strong engagement culture. We're always looking to innovate and improve our practice. Sorry, this poll keeps on popping up. And in Boulder, the city and the county are working together at the moment to update our comprehensive plan. And this is a process that happens every 10 years. And the plan includes overarching policies for Boulder across lots of different sectors like transportation, land use. It'll also include an updated land use map, so it's quite consequential in shaping the future of our city. And we're implementing our first assembly as an input to this comprehensive plan. And this community assembly that's part of the comprehensive plan will be tasked with examining and discussing different locations and ways of implementing 15-minute neighborhoods in the Boulder Valley. 15-minute neighborhoods, in case you're not familiar with the concept, places where people can access most of their daily needs within a 15-minute walk or bike. And it's hard because it requires change to neighborhoods. We currently have a more suburban layout. So this assembly will be wrestling with if is this a good idea? Do we want to move more in this direction? And how and where should we move in that direction for more compact, walkable neighborhoods? So similar to Victoria, we sent 10,000 invitations. We had 240 applicants. Our assembly has 48 randomly selected members according to a representation model. We have a total of 7 meetings on Saturdays over 5 months, and 2 meetings have been completed, with the final meeting being in October. City of Boulder is financing this assembly 100% with its own funds. This may be a little bit different for our first assembly. We didn't seek grant partnerships. I wanted to acknowledge somebody asked about having meetings on Saturdays in the chat, and how that can be a barrier for people for faith reasons. We did realize this afterwards, and we are bringing in an interfaith panel to be able to bring in some of those voices not able to participate on Saturdays, but this is definitely something to keep in mind for the future. For Boulder, for our first assembly, our budget is just under 200,000. And about 40% of that is for consultants, which includes the wonderful guidance of Mass LBP. And also about a quarter of that is for participant stipends. So we are providing $1,000 in total for participation on the 7 Saturdays. Those are our 2 largest expenses. And the other larger expenses are for removing barriers to participation. So for example, for interpretation and translation, and childcare for those who need it to participate. So I'll stop there with context, maybe, and just share 4 lessons related to financing. So the first one is, I think you have to make it worth the money. So if you're pitching an assembly, you're probably asking for more money than the city is used to spending on public participation. So you need a pretty strong mandate. We all know we're in a financially constrained environment, so just be sure to pick a topic that's timely, visible, meaningful to the whole ecosystem, including staff, policymakers, and the community. In our case, it was strategic to tie it to our once-in-a-decade comprehensive plan update because sizable funds are set aside for this planning process. And we thought this could be something that people could get behind. Second lesson I wanted to share is to identify what you can do in-house. So we knew from the onset that we wanted to build our internal capacity to deliver assemblies and not fully outsource them. And we also knew this was key to keeping the costs down, and that would be an important piece of the proof of concept also. Having said that, though, it's important to have knowledgeable partners, especially when assemblies are new to you in the organization. But my advice is just to be strategic about what to contract out, and that will vary depending on your internal capacity. But I think what I've learned is that external support is important for the pieces that require neutrality or specialized skills, or that you just don't have the capacity to do well on a short timeline. In our case, we outsource the sortition and co-facilitation of the meetings and also the independent evaluation, which is intrinsic in the name independent. And, you know, I do think that grants can be important for kickstarting it and getting that buy-in and for demonstration, but my advice would just be to use them strategically and include a strong learning or mentoring component to reduce that long-term dependency on external parties. And my third lesson, and something I heard also maybe from Richard, is to find internal champions and to cost share if possible. So in our case, 200,000 might seem pretty big, but maybe not as big if it's shared between departments or between agencies, like we heard from Richard was the case in Victoria, with cost sharing among jurisdictions. So in our case, we had cost sharing between two different departments, between our communications and engagement department, who has the mandate to advance organizational learning and innovation and engagement. And so they were willing to fund the consultants who trained us and helped us with design. And then the other department, planning and development services, is funding everything else essentially. Things like mailings and the meeting logistics, because they are leading the comp plan and this assembly is supporting the comp plan. So, you know, when you're thinking about it, ask which departments in your city or jurisdiction might share costs and try to align those pieces of the overall cost with the mandate of those departments. My fourth and final message is about building mutually beneficial partnerships. So you might be able to identify some partners locally or nationally who would really welcome the opportunity to collaborate and sometimes at a below market rate. So I do not mean that we should not be paying people properly for their work, but sometimes you might find that there are researchers or facilitators who would love to partner because it's part of their research anyway. We did find that with CU Boulder locally, who are doing some case studies on deliberative processes. They were also able to help us identify grad students as small table facilitators who are maybe not as expensive as facilitators on the market. You might be able to find evaluators who are exploring new methods and excited to partner. And the benefit also of finding such partnerships are that you're strengthening your local ecosystems, knowledge, and experience, and that also helps build legitimacy locally with assemblies. So I'll just close for now by saying that we have taken on this experiment with a longer term view, you know, to see if this is something that we want to continue doing. Have the policymakers found this valuable as well? But it does take resources to do it well. And I would also argue that it's a solid investment. So be sure to pitch it in terms of its value to the city, value of building a more representative pool of engaged citizens. And also, in my view, it's a relatively small amount of money compared to the potential changes or benefits it could bring. So I will end there and excited for the discussion.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. I mean, this has already been such a rich and fascinating conversation. I am going to try to pull some threads together, integrate some questions, and then give the panelists a chance to sort of talk between themselves. I'm really grateful. I see folks are using the chat function. They're also using the Q&A. What's sort of interesting is I'm seeing this kind of these two parallel tracks, right? We're having one conversation that's really about the nuts and bolts of financing, which is really interesting, but it's also like sort of what are you comparing the context to? You know, apparently we spent $16 billion with a B dollars on the 2024 presidential election in the United States. Just gonna let that number sit in with folks. And I think there are real questions around when you think about day-to-day governance, when you think about re-engaging folks in democracy, you know, the connective tissue in between elections, on some level, like that's more, you know, value for your money, right? Than sort of a one-time shop every 2 or 4 years. If you're thinking of sort of amortization over time, if you're actually able to train people and create some of these self-fulfilling mechanisms, that's very interesting. It's also interesting, but it's great to have sort of the Canadian perspective. I think here in the US, we are allergic to paying people to participate. And it's something that's always been very surprising to me in my 15 years of studying this stuff, because why can't we value what we, people's time? I think if we want people to engage, I think we have to sort of get over that hump that we can reduce barriers to entry and create more opportunities for accessibility if we're able to be really thoughtful, as all of the leaders on this call are, about childcare, translation, food, accommodations. But it's not how we approach engagement. So I do think there is a mind shift, at least in the United States. So that's sort of one thread. And then there was an interesting question in the chat around the role of catalytic funding, right? Should foundations, philanthropic dollars come in? My view is sort of thinking of foundations and philanthropic capital as sort of reducing barriers to entry, being catalytic, taking risks when others can't. But that is one question that I saw a little heat in the chat. I'd love to get your opinions on. We're getting a lot of really powerful questions also about how are these recommendations and decisions followed through on the local and regional level? And how are they impacted by changing political leadership? And then if you think about the feedback loop, if and how does that come back to these questions around financing? So I'm going to take that as one tranche of questions. We're getting really great stuff in the Q&A. Please keep doing it. So I invite the panelists to sort of share some reactions to that, and as well as anything you heard from your co-panelists, and then we'll head over to some more questions.
I'd be happy to jump in, Hollie. Just I saw that there was a question asking kind of me to follow up on the question around like stipends and paying people their time and sort of bolstering civic participation through these processes. And similarly here with Mass, we've always prioritized budgeting towards removing barriers, enhancing participation. Through improving accessibility, but also creating the best experience for members as part of that participation. And so what we found is that when we have to kind of make trade-offs with budgets, sometimes we just cannot and have not prioritized paying people a flat stipend to participate. Part of that again is a budget crunch. It's a trade-off. I think Vivian talked a little bit about the importance of removing barriers, childcare, elder care, flexibility around religious schedules, things like that, having to do some things online versus in person. Having to engage, if you have like a process that goes over many months, you have to have regular touch points. You have to devote a bit more staff time and maybe facilitator time to engaging with people and keeping the momentum going. We also believe in the importance of feeding people well and ensuring that they have kind of like a great time. If you're spending 7 or 8 hours of your day, you need to have a great environment, a great space. You need to have a room that's set up with great lighting and multiple screens and everything that kind of goes. And sometimes the trade-off is we can't. And to give you an example of Victoria Saanich, they did want us to prioritize paying a flat rate of like $100 per session, which is only a token amount of people, paying people's time anyway. Part of the problem is that the project was funded and authorized in 2018 dollars and executed in 2024 dollars, which, if you know anything about inflation over the past 6 years, was a bit of a challenge. So I certainly recommend tightening those windows where possible. The pandemic played a big role in that delay as well. So I wanted to address that question as well. Maybe I'll yield to others, and we can come back to some of these kind of larger questions around kind of budgets and kind of leveling up and having champions around funding to make things sustainable.
I can, just maybe riff a little bit on the stipend question. We were pretty clear from the beginning that it would be important for Boulder. We have an established community advisory group. It's called the Community Connector Program. And so we thought we should pay a comparable amount. So we kind of worked it out by hour or something like that so that it would be comparable. And we just thought that $1,000 was not like too much, but it's still substantial to show that we're respecting their time. And we also knew that it would be pretty hard to get certain voices in the room, certain demographics to apply. And we just thought for this first time it would be like a draw, and hopefully we would get younger voices as well who would be pretty excited maybe by that amount. And I think it worked. It does set a precedent. And so I think you just need to be sure that that's the right fit for your organization, and you could do it in the future as well.
Linn, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in on this. Yeah, we take the view of that we think paying folks is really important as sort of that sort of ethical basics. Somebody mentioned in the chat here that we're getting paid, you should be getting paid. In fact, there's one example of a different project that we lightly helped out on that paid everyone, staff and folks on the assembly, the same hourly rate, actually, which I think is fabulous because the assembly is doing the hardest work of anybody there. And I think there's a great justification for that. Um, I was looking at our numbers in terms of our breakdown. We aim for around 20 to 30% of every project going directly to delegates as direct payment, either most of that stipends, but some of that is direct reimbursements. And we generally use like an average uh, hourly wage sort of equivalent for the stipend in a particular area. And then another 20 to 30% would go toward accessibility or equity-based services, including language and learner technology and all that kind of thing. And then a lot of the rest of it goes toward process design and coordination. I think one of the things that is really missing, and really interesting to hear that your communications department, Vivian, got involved in funding this. I think that is a super great angle that honestly I've never thought to explore before with cities. Um, because I think the communications budget for these projects, not just in the US or but elsewhere, is really lacking, is the most lacking thing in our processes at least. Um, and we've sort of played around with the idea of, wow, what would it look like to have really, try to, and we did this actually in Fort Collins. We tried to fundraise around the communications budget specifically, and slightly successfully. We did get $20,000-$30,000, I think, for that specifically, but not it wasn't nearly as successful as we wanted. We wanted to try to match the city's commitment in that case with another 150 total, of which a bunch would go to comms, and that wasn't feasible. And just one more note, somebody mentioned a moment ago I think, Hollie, you mentioned the sort of relative cost to other things. Geez, I think that's a part of this argument that we should be making a lot more. And the elections are so easy because the costs are just ridiculous at the local level, state and national. But also for public engagement. I mean, it is a hundreds of millions, probably low billion-dollar industry, and very much an industry. And there is a lot of money being spent by cities on what we at least consider to be old-fashioned, not very great public engagement. And in the case of one city, for example, they just before we did an assembly there, they had spent, I think, $350,000 to a firm to do a couple of meetings and a focus group and a glossy report, and it didn't move the needle on the issue, hence why the assembly was happening. And they were thrilled to spend substantial amounts of money on a thing that would hopefully move the topic forward.
Do others want to jump in on this? I mean, I think it'd be very interesting to think about how you all are connecting. We have some really great questions here around sort of connecting this to then the recommendations and how they're followed through. And then also the role of participants as ambassadors, right? Is that something that you've all experienced? Like in my own research, I've seen people totally transformed by attending and being part of these processes, seeing how the proverbial sausage is made, seeing how trade-offs are, it's a sort of a hands-on real life civic education. But would be really curious to hear, I guess it's sort of like, how do you piece this all together, right? You have the inputs, you have these questions around funding and sustainability, but then it's also the questions of what is the experience like as a participant, and then also what's the experience like as an organizer, thinking about the Mass LBP and the Healthy Democracy, and then in the city of Boulder, what is this experience like so that you can then have the air cover to your peers? Let's start with that. There's a lot of good stuff here.
I mean, maybe I can go first because I have the least experience.
Perfect.
We just completed our second meeting, but I can say it's magical. Like, it is transformational. People are really happy to be there and like really engaged in meetings until the end of the day. Like, it's really impressive. And so I think our job will be making sure that this is like tied into our comp plan process really well. and they have the opportunity to present directly to our policymakers, like in the context of the planning process we're in. So there's just a lot of cooks in the kitchen with different departments in the city and things like that. So we have a lot of work on our back end to make sure that all those connections are made. But I think even though it is about the personal experience of each assembly member and how they communicate about it, and then about the recommendations, like it's all linked to funding, because if it's not useful, then you will not attract financing for it in the future, right? So it is important to have a good experience that everybody finds useful. And a couple of other things we're doing in the city, we're working with, we have some artists who are embedded into the assembly who will help kind of communicate out and do some of the storytelling around it. So we don't have anything to share yet, but I can share more about that when we have something to share. And then we have the independent evaluation by FIDE and a local partner that we're looking forward to, because I think that'll give us a lot of rich understanding of the experience and the process design. You're on mute. Oh, go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, I'll click on that. There's some questions around sort of the upskilling of the staff in Boulder and sort of how that was working. Like, who are you working side by side with an implementation partner? And then also, Linn and Richard, I want to bring you into this. Questions around how do you think about transparency in this processes to the general public? And there's one question about comparing the Boulder process to the Bend, Oregon process.
I can just quickly share about our consultant support. So we have three, I would say, like consultant partners. One of them is FIDE for the independent evaluation. And then we're working with Mass LBP. And so what we partnered or contracted with Mass LBP to do was to build our internal capacity to understand what is an assembly and help us build that internal knowledge and buy-in and help us get to a mandate that would be strong enough for an assembly. And so it's been like a technical support partnership, but also mentoring. And I would say it was heavier in the beginning and then less and less, helped us with the design of our assemblies, but they also undertook the lottery. So we knew that was something that would require substantial learning on our part. We weren't familiar with the software and et cetera. So they did that, and that was really helpful, I think, so we could focus on other pieces of the process at that time. And then we've also partnered with CU Boulder for co-facilitation. So the moderator is a city engagement staff, so not somebody from the planning department who's really entrenched in the comprehensive plan, but she's an engagement manager and helping moderate the meetings. But the activities are really facilitated by these external University of Colorado Boulder facilitators who are compensated.
That's great. Richard and Linn, please join the party.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in and just pick up on this question around like transparency and communications and kind of building up the public capacity to understand, participate, know about, move forward processes like these. To give you an example, with us, we build in communication strategies with all of the assemblies we work on and try to work on that in partnership with, say, for example, municipal communications departments of Victoria and Saanich. So that part of my job is having regular touch points with them, regular meetings to align what they need to communicate to the public with kind of the process and technical information and knowledge that we bring. And establishing those relationships is really, really critical. Transparency, of course, is very important, can be communicated through various channels. Having a really great website, great FAQ, when you're dealing with public money, transparency, of course, has so many bars it must meet. But in general, the idea is bringing the public in as much as possible, and then having channels and platforms to kind of cascade that out, especially among certain inflection points, like when we were getting ready to host a public meeting. All of a sudden, there's a flurry of public interest, and that needs to be kind of streamlined and communicated across the way as we prepare to publish the technical study, which goes out to the public, or even the final report. We do tend to reserve a bit of budget to produce like a video about the process of the assembly, to invite the public and invite government officials kind of inside the process through that medium, which has proved to be fairly effective, more so than producing like an 80-page report, which If you're lucky, people will read the executive summary if they're not, otherwise engaged in it. So having multiple of those channels can be really, really helpful and really effective. We're still in the stage, even in Canada, where we've done 50 plus of these, and we've got colleagues and friends at like Institut du Nouveau Monde in Quebec that have run a whole bunch as well. And yet we're still in the phase of getting people aware of what this means in democratic life and in social life, right? And that's going to be around still for quite some time. So that public messaging, that communications, whether you can do it in-house, whether you can partner, I think is really important. I do want to say too, as well, like, to Vivian's point earlier about picking projects that are going to have an impact, they're going to have buy-in from multiple stakeholders is really important towards cascading this forward, right? Like if you have an assembly that, where the recommendations are taken up or stir public debate, lead to policy changes, regulatory changes, whatever it is, even though that's going to take time, when you can kind of plant a flag in a few of those, as we've seen over the years, that makes a really big impact in being able to secure the next funding, to convince the next councillor, elected member of parliament, et cetera, like that. And the last thing I wanted to pick about, I think somebody asked about like the role of assembly members themselves, of ambassadors. This is critical. I think Vivian talked a little bit about just, what it's been like so far with the first couple of sessions there in Boulder and just the engagement. By the end of these processes, the joke goes at mass that we've never conducted an assembly where somebody didn't recommend another assembly as like coming out of the recommendations, right? People do come to see, who are part of these processes, the value in not just kind of the policy question they're wrestling with, but also just like the sense of community engagement, the fact that this brings community together, gives them a specific challenge or task to do that isn't about like wider, personal political opinions and, left, right, everything else, but about the matter at hand. And then they become ambassadors. And so we do try to rally that spirit of being an ambassador in whatever ways we can, including putting assembly members together, including having them go out to say, deliver their own public meetings, like kind of neighborhood associations or things like that, to kind of be ambassadors for the process, and to look for both formal and informal ways to kind of do that forward. So all those things are really, really important, and I'm happy if that prompts any further questions. But let me throw it over to Linn too.
Cool. Yeah, it's funny. Yeah, we say the same thing. Somebody at one point was like, you should have a portion in the assembly where the assembly can talk about more assemblies. And we're like, no, 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 no. First of all, that would be incredibly self-serving and weird. But second of all, inevitably it happens anyway, every single time, without fail. It happened in Fort Collins just the other week. I was going to say, in terms of advocates, absolutely the best advocates. And if we're sort of practicing what we preach, they should be the ones in the conferences, on our boards of directors. We think they should be the people in permanent governance bodies that oversee permanent systems like this. Yeah, put people in power. If that's what we're trying to change here, is the power paradigm, then we need to demonstrate that most of all within the systems that we're creating, even if they're one-shot kind of projects, they can still be treated as systems like that. For example, I mentioned this Petaluma process where we had a section of the funds, about 20% of the total money, both for staff time or for in-process staff time and for pay for the delegates and expenses, that was theirs to decide how to spend, as part of subcommittees that were created. So they had sort of in-house process design firm, in-house PR firm, in-house evaluation. They went out and did survey at a farmer's market and about the results, and an in-house sort of lobbying firm. And they had sort of technical assistants assigned to each of those, staff support, and then they decided how to spend that money over the next 6 months or so after the project. And incidentally, my colleague Grace is in the chat here, and if you remember things or I'm saying things wrong, please jump in about that. But I think that was like some of the best money we've ever spent in a project. I was just going to mention on the question about private funding. I think that was a lot earlier, but it's okay. My view on this right now, having done projects of all different kinds, fully private, fully public, and mix, is that I think we are at a stage, both because of the quantity of public money already spent on engagement at the local level, and because of the number of examples. These are not pilot projects anymore. We know there's hundreds and hundreds of examples of sort of local one-shot issue-based assemblies. that we should be looking for some substantial level of public funding. I think at least half of a project. But we could use public funding to catalyze private funding or private funding to catalyze public funding in that case. And in the latter, I think there's great potential. Mass has been a leader in suggesting sort of a national trust for public funds. And there's folks here in the US who are working on gathering funds sort of among collections of Hollie included, uh, of foundations to sort of have as a stockpile to either catalyze public money or react to public money. Um, and then I think totally private money is still important in situations where something new and experimental is happening, or where something is happening that's really power shifty or threatening to the political system in a way that the public funds are just not going to be able to fund that. And that's a great use and always has been for philanthropy. Things like writing ballot measures through an initiative process, as we proposed. That is almost certainly never going to happen by public funds until there's a ballot measure that demands that that system gets institutionalized. But there's an avenue where it's going to totally depend on somebody being like, yeah, let's try this out. This can push a transformative potential change, and we can see how we can attach a communication strategy to this to get to public funds later.
I know, Richard, you're dying to get in. Just get in there.
Well,
Fabulous.
I was perusing some of the other questions
A lot of
as
content.
well, and I wanted to also emphasize the notion of educating journalists in all of this. Where possible, we have tried to work with local journalists who can not only be part of the kind of the storytelling process, but and the public education around this as well. I think there was a question around what steps can be taken to convince the public of its value. It's one thing to work with communications departments and kind of do your own communications, but working with trusted public institutions, which hopefully in your communities and many still include local journalism. At least you're not going to convince CNN of this anytime soon, but you're going to convince your local beat reporter about how this connects to important civic issues, how it kind of as I was talking about with Victoria and Saanich, like getting at a public issue that seems stuck or seems like it does need some sort of public consultation, broader input in order to actually be successful. And I think that's, those kinds of talking points, those kinds of things, I think really tap into getting that public buy-in. Not that we have to stereotype government as all being sort of stuck in the mud and dragging its feet moving slowly. That's not what I'm saying at all. It's more that you do kind of convince members of the public, journalism's other institutions, that there is collective value in all of this, and you can tell that story in as many ways as you possibly can. There's no one single thing that's done. It has to be kind of done in multiple stages, through multiple communications channels, and again, taking advantage of trust wherever that trust exists. And I know that's a big thing to say at a time like this in our democracy, but it is really, really important. I saw a couple of questions around that, so I just wanted to pick up on that too.
Oh, I think that's fantastic. I mean, I think, in the next 4 minutes, we'll just solve all these problems and answer all of these questions. I mean, I think there's a lot of questions here, I think, about, we sort of are touching on this public-private. I mean, my philosophy for a long time has been that we really need blended capital approaches and that no one sector is going to do all of this. But it's sort of the question of what is the right entry point and at what point in the process. But that's just sort of like my opinion. It's very, very interesting to hear from all of you. I guess I'd be curious, in this political climate, are there any things that either this group, we have a very educated sort of inside baseball group on this call, I'm gathering from the amazing and very specific questions. I'd like to give everyone just one quick more round in like 90 seconds to just share with us sort of if you have any takeaways or sort of how you're approaching your work, given all the questions we've raised, but just in this moment. And we're seeing also, we will share after this the signups for the different organizations. As I mentioned, we're having a follow-on event on September 11th, thinking about the role of citizen assemblies in the broader reform movement. So we know this is an ongoing conversation, but I just wanted to give each of you one last chance to kind of, end with a little bit of a provocation for all of us. So Linn, maybe I'll start with you.
Oh my. Well, this has been really fun. Grateful to be invited and always wonderful to participate in an event like this. And I was just thinking about time. I feel like this relates to money because we are often in a situation where we're reacting to a political context where the political will is strong and we want to strike while the iron is hot, or there's a particular challenge that needs to be addressed before a certain deadline. And this is often, I think, I'm sort of wondering how others feel about this because I think I'm starting to feel at one time I felt like we should just go for it. Go for it. Any opportunity we can make something of this. And now I'm feeling a little bit more like we should maybe be a little bit more selective. And I was just talking to a large city who's really interested in doing something and was advising them, hey, especially in a larger geography and for a first time thing in the region, maybe we should like wait a little bit. Maybe like wait for it. And there was one case where we waited 3 years, went through 3 or 4 different topics, and finally landed on a really great one, put together a mixture of funding. It allows for more time to sort of collect a coalition, of advocates on the ground, which is we sort of touched on, but is very important and is one of the key reasons why that project I mentioned didn't happen earlier. That's separate from the process team and the content folks in the city and so forth. But it also allows for communications to be built, some art we were going to, sort of things to be built in the community in different creative ways. It allows for engagement with community members in broad ways or more specific community-based engagement. And it allows for funding to be collected. I wonder.
All right, 30 seconds. Vivian and Richard.
Oh, sorry.
It was fabulous. It's great.
Mine is quick. Just leave you with the thought of your pitch. So when you're pitching this, rather than talking about the cost, your budget, talk about the cost of not doing it. The cost of muddling through, of not finding resolution, of political whatever. Like, I think you can turn it around and show the value. Show this is an investment that is really pretty small relative to the value.
Well, I wholeheartedly echo what both Linn and Vivian have said about connecting the value, about being selective and strategic about what you pursue. And to that, I'll just close with, I've always been a fan of the line from Albert Zur, the political scientist, who talked about democracy in the trenches. And that is what citizens' assemblies are and have been and continue to be alongside other wonderful democratic innovations. And at the same time, while we continue to work in the trenches, we talk a little bit about leveling up and getting out of the trenches and connecting these things more broadly. We absolutely do need to have dedicated funding. It's a long-term goal of MAS to advocate for what we call democratic action funds, where when you think about how much it costs to run an election, what was it, 16 billion? In America, it's only like 600 million in Canada, but still, that's still quite a lot. And if we could convince within 20 years government to set aside a commensurate amount, like even 5% of running an election, that would be $30 million in Canada that could fund 100 assemblies per year. We got a lot of steps to get to between now and then, and I'm sure in America that's the case too. But we got to start thinking on both of those levels, in the trenches and out of the trenches too.
Great. Well, thank you. You see these extraordinary leaders taking time out of this amazing work. We're so grateful to you. A big thank you to Marjan, Tom, Sarah, Anna, Priya, and Columbia World Projects and FIDE North America. And thank you all for these really thoughtful questions. As I mentioned, we will follow up with more information, and we hope you'll tune in on September 11th. Thank you all. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Everybody.